A video began circulating, showing people shouting near the shoreline of Horn Island, and within hours, the internet had convinced itself that it captured Nolan Wells in an altercation shortly before he disappeared. But there was a problem. The person who recorded the video later said Nolan wasn't in it at all. And yet, Nolan's own family attorney had described an altercation on the island and questioned whether it could be connected to what happened to him. So, which version is true? Was there actually a confrontation involving Nolan before he vanished, or did a misleading video send an entire investigation down the wrong path? That question matters because Nolan's body was found 2 days after he disappeared. His cause of death remained unresolved by the family's independent autopsy, and investigators were still examining what happened during those final hours. Before we dive into the case, if you follow true crime stories where the smallest details can completely change the picture, take a second to subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always want to know how far these cases reach. Now, let's go back to the 4th of July 2026. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a college football player from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, with ambitions of continuing his athletic career. On July 4, Nolan traveled by boat with friends to Horn Island, a remote barrier island off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. It was supposed to be a holiday celebration. Instead, Nolan would disappear, and 2 days later, searchers would find his body near the western end of the island. At first glance, the case appeared to have a straightforward explanation. Nolan may have drowned, but almost immediately, questions began accumulating. Why had Nolan not returned with the others? What happened during the hours before he disappeared? And why was a video showing an apparent confrontation suddenly being connected to him? Those questions became even more important when the Jackson County Sheriff's Office publicly asked people who had been on Horn Island that day to provide photographs, videos, eyewitness accounts, and information about any altercations, arguments, or disturbances they witnessed. That request didn't prove Nolan had been involved in a fight, but it showed investigators were interested in what had happened on the island that day. And then the video appeared. The footage was short. It showed people near the shoreline, with boats gathered around the area. Voices could be heard during what appeared to be a heated confrontation. Online, however, the footage quickly acquired a much more specific meaning. People began claiming that the young man at the center of the confrontation was Nolan Wells. Screenshots and reposts spread across social media. The implication was chilling. Nolan had allegedly been involved in some kind of confrontation shortly before he vanished. And if that were true, it could have completely changed the timeline investigators were trying to reconstruct. But there was something viewers couldn't know simply by watching a few seconds of viral footage. The identity of the person in the video had not been independently established. The original photographer later said the video was recorded to send to their spouse. After learning about Nolan's disappearance, they uploaded it, hoping someone might recognize him, but they said people subsequently began falsely identifying Nolan as one of the people involved. Then another piece of information emerged. Traciston Shepard, a friend of Nolan's, said he was the person whose voice could be heard yelling in the video. According to reporting, the disagreement captured on video actually began between Shepard and his girlfriend, not as a confrontation involving Nolan. That created a major contradiction, because while the viral footage was being presented online as evidence that Nolan had been involved in a fight, the people connected to the recording were saying something very different. And this is where the mystery becomes more complicated. Nolan's family was not simply dealing with an internet rumor. Their attorney, Benjamin Crump, had publicly raised questions about what happened on the boat and said the family believed there had been an altercation. At the same time, authorities were still investigating and had not publicly identified a suspect in Nolan's death. Then came the discovery that would make every detail from July 4 more important. Nolan was gone. His friends returned without him. And eventually, his body was found. The question was no longer simply who was in the video. It was, what actually happened to Nolan during the final hours before he disappeared? And the answer would depend on more than a viral clip. It would depend on the timeline, the boat, the emergency call, Nolan's movements, and evidence recovered after his death. Because the most important clue in this case may not be the video that everyone was watching. It may be what the video doesn't show. The problem was that the video people thought showed Nolan may not have shown Nolan at all. But there was another recording from that same afternoon that investigators could not simply dismiss. At around 4 p.m. on July 4, A frantic emergency call was placed from the boat Nolan and his friends had used to reach Horn Island.
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can y'all please come? We have a membership. Shut up! Shut the fuck up!
The caller reported that the boat was taking on water because of a malfunctioning bilge pump and said there were 7 people aboard. That detail matters because investigators already knew something unusual had happened. Nolan would not be on the boat when it eventually left Horn Island. GPS data obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources showed the vessel arriving at Horn Island at approximately 11:14 that morning. It remained there for several hours. Then, at approximately 4:31 p.m., the boat left the island. Nolan wasn't aboard. The boat returned to its original dock, later traveled toward Fort Bayou, and eventually returned again. The movements created a documented timeline of where the vessel went, but GPS can tell investigators where a boat was. It cannot tell them what happened to a person standing on the shoreline, and that was the problem. Some accounts said Nolan had chosen to remain on the island after meeting a young woman. His family strongly questioned that explanation. They pointed to the fact that Nolan's phone and keys were not with him when he disappeared. His parents also questioned why their son, who they believed would normally return with his group, would suddenly separate from everyone else. Then there was the emergency call. The audio raised new questions because the caller said everyone was aboard and safe, even though Nolan was later reported to have remained behind. That doesn't automatically prove anyone lied. There could be explanations for the apparent contradiction, but investigators now had to establish exactly when Nolan separated from the group, who last saw him, and what everyone knew at each stage. And that timeline became even more important after Nolan's body was discovered. On the morning of July 6th, searchers found his body in the water near Horn Island. He was wearing swim trunks. The initial circumstances led authorities to consider drowning as a possibility, and officials said there were no obvious signs of homicidal trauma. But the medical evidence did not immediately provide the definitive answer everyone was looking for. Nolan's family's independent autopsy was inconclusive, and the official state autopsy was completed later, but authorities decided not to release the findings publicly before a grand jury reviews the case. That decision is significant. It doesn't mean prosecutors have determined that a crime occurred. It doesn't mean someone has been identified as responsible, and it certainly doesn't prove that Nolan was murdered. What it means is that the investigation remains active enough for prosecutors to present the death investigation to a grand jury. And while the official medical findings remain sealed, another question has continued to follow the case. What happened during the gap between Nolan's last confirmed sighting and the moment the boat left? That gap is now one of the central mysteries. A recent review of available photographs, videos, GPS information, and witness accounts described a material gap in the timeline. And that is precisely why the altercation story matters. Not because the viral video proves Nolan was attacked. It doesn't. In fact, the person who recorded it disputed the claim that Nolan was even present. But investigators were already asking the public to provide information about arguments and altercations that occurred on the island that day. So there may have been confrontations on Horn Island. The unresolved question is whether any of them had anything to do with Nolan. And there is another complication. Horn Island was crowded on July 4. Hundreds of people reportedly gathered there for the holiday. Witnesses described boats packed around the island, people moving between groups, and strong currents developing later in the afternoon. That creates two competing possibilities investigators have to separate. One is tragic but natural. Nolan could have entered the water, encountered dangerous currents, and drowned. The other is that something happened before he entered the water, and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance have not yet been fully explained. At this point, neither possibility has been publicly established as the definitive answer. And that distinction is important, because online, theories have moved much faster than the evidence. People have identified individuals in videos. They have interpreted fragments of audio. They have accused people who have not been charged. But the actual investigation has a much higher burden. It has to determine what happened to Nolan, not what makes the most compelling theory on social media. And that brings us back to the video. If Nolan wasn't in it, then the footage cannot answer the central question. But it can tell investigators something else. It demonstrates that arguments and disturbances were happening around the same time and place that Nolan disappeared. The challenge is determining whether those events were connected or simply another coincidence in a crowded holiday gathering. Meanwhile, Nolan's friends have continued to deny involvement in his death. Their attorneys have even returned with them to Horn Island to better understand the physical location where Nolan disappeared, while maintaining that the young men had nothing to do with his death. And the investigation is now entering a different phase. The official autopsy has been completed. The findings remain with prosecutors. The grand jury is expected to review the medical evidence alongside other investigative material, and Nolan's family has hired experts to examine the emergency call itself, hoping the audio might reveal information that wasn't obvious when the recording was first released. So the question isn't simply whether there was an altercation. The bigger question is whether the timeline investigators are reconstructing can explain every movement, every statement, and every piece of evidence from those final hours. Because if the timeline holds together, the case may point toward a tragic accident. But if there is a significant unexplained gap, and investigators find evidence that someone knew more than they initially said, that could completely change the direction of the case. And that is where Nolan Wells' mystery currently stands. A viral video has not established that Nolan was involved in an altercation. The autopsy has not publicly established exactly how he died, and no one has been publicly charged with causing his death. For Nolan's family, the unanswered questions remain. If you want to follow this case as investigators move toward the grand jury and new evidence becomes available, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next update. And if you have been following Nolan's case, tell me in the comments, what do you think is the most important unanswered question? The timeline, the emergency call, the altercation reports, or the autopsy findings? Most importantly, remember that behind every theory, every video, and every headline is a real person whose family is still waiting for answers.